The sun cast a warm glow over the century-old Victorian home, its signature purple trim standing defiantly against the modern beige houses that lined the street. Sitting on the porch swing, sipping coffee, Sarah Martinez found solace in the familiar scent of her grandmother's rose garden. But peace was fleeting in this neighborhood, especially with Karen Thompson around. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the newly formed Homeowners Association, was already making her rounds, marching toward Sarah's mailbox with an envelope clutched like a prized possession. Sarah had seen that look before, the smug determination of someone who believed they were untouchable. She retrieved the envelope and scanned its contents. A $5,000 membership fee, monthly dues of $350, a list of mandatory modifications, including removing her beloved purple trim, tearing out her grandmother's heirloom roses, and dismantling the antique wind chimes that had lulled her to sleep since childhood. Sarah exhaled sharply, her grip tightening on the letter. She had spent her career upholding justice, but now justice needed to be served on her own doorstep. What Karen didn't know was that the woman she was trying to intimidate was far more powerful than she appeared, and Sarah had no intention of backing down. Sarah stood at Karen Thompson's doorstep, the HOA invitation in hand. The door swung open, revealing Karen in her signature neighborhood watch captain badge, her lips stretching into an insincere smile. "I've reviewed your invitation," Sarah said, keeping her voice calm. "I have to decline. This house has been in my family for 3 generations. I intend to preserve its historic character." Karen's smile vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped frown. "You don't understand," she said, leaning in. "This isn't really an invitation. The HOA is already formed. Your property is the last holdout." Sarah had anticipated this. She pulled out a carefully researched map. "Actually, my deed predates any HOA agreements. I have no legal obligation to join." Karen's face turned an interesting shade of red. "Listen here," she hissed. "This neighborhood is changing. If you don't get with the program, things might get difficult. Accidents happen. Citations get filed. Fines add up." Sarah met Karen's gaze steadily. "Is that a threat, Mrs. Thompson?" Karen stepped back, her fake smile returning. "Of course not. Just looking out for the safety of your home. Old houses like yours, they can be unpredictable." Sarah's instincts screamed that this was more than a casual warning. As she walked back to her home, she noticed movement behind the curtains of neighboring houses. Watching eyes. Karen wasn't alone in this. That night, Sarah installed security cameras, making sure to document every inch of her property. Experience had taught her to trust her gut. And right now, her gut told her Karen was just getting started. The following morning, Sarah awoke to the sound of Karen's shrill voice. Peeking through her curtains, she saw Karen leading a group of HOA members on what they called an inspection. "Look at that hideous purple trim," Karen declared. "It's destroying our property values." Sarah watched as they snapped photos, whispering amongst themselves. Each day brought new complaints, each more absurd than the last. Bright orange violation notices were taped to her door. Her grandmother's rose garden, once a neighborhood gem, was now labeled a nuisance. Karen even measured Sarah's grass with a ruler, declaring it was 3 inches over regulation. The harassment escalated. Landscapers arrived at 7 a.m. sharp on Saturdays, their equipment conveniently loudest near Sarah's bedroom window. Anonymous complaints flooded City Hall. HOA meetings were held in Karen's driveway, directly outside Sarah's home office. The final straw came when Sarah checked her security footage one night. Karen and two board members were skulking around her property at midnight, chemical sprayers in hand, poisoning her grandmother's century-old roses. "What do you think you're doing?" Sarah's voice cut through the darkness. Karen jumped but recovered quickly. "Just handling invasive species. If you joined the HOA, this could be done properly." Sarah clenched her fists. Karen had just made a critical mistake, one that would set everything in motion. Sarah barely slept that night. The image of Karen and her cronies poisoning her grandmother's cherished roses burned in her mind. But it wasn't just about flowers. It was about control, intimidation, and corruption. Karen wanted her out, and Sarah knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, as Sarah reviewed her security footage, she noticed something even more disturbing. Two HOA board members had been inspecting her property markers and utility boxes under the cover of darkness. Their hushed conversation caught on audio mentioned easement regulations, permits, and something about accelerating the process. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. This wasn't just about pressuring her to join the HOA. They were planning something bigger. The following week, the harassment escalated. Her mailbox was knocked over 3 times. Anonymous complaints were filed about excessive noise, on days she wasn't even home. Code enforcement officers showed up daily, citing fabricated violations. Her garbage bins mysteriously disappeared, only to be reported as left out illegally. Then, during the annual neighborhood block party, an event Sarah was, of course, not invited to, Karen made her boldest move yet. Standing in front of a crowd of HOA members, she gestured toward Sarah's home. "Some properties," she announced loudly, "just don't fit our community's vision. But don't worry, we have ways of handling these situations." Sarah, watching from her porch, tightened her grip on her coffee cup. She knew what was coming. That night, she reviewed her footage once more. Karen's group had become emboldened. They stood outside her house, pointing at specific structural features: her foundation, her windows, her electrical boxes. Sarah's gut twisted. She had spent her career dealing with criminals who thought they were untouchable. But Karen wasn't a mastermind. She was a bully with a sense of entitlement. And like all bullies, she would eventually go too far. And she did. A week later, Sarah was sitting in her courtroom when her clerk, Emily, burst through the doors, face pale as a ghost. "Your Honor, your house, it's on fire." The words didn't register at first. Then everything blurred. Sarah tore off her judge's robe and ran 15 minutes. That's how long it took to drive home. It felt like hours. From 3 blocks away, she could already see the thick black smoke curling into the sky. The closer she got, the stronger the smell of burning wood and destruction. Her home, her grandmother's home, was engulfed in flames. The Victorian trim she'd fought so hard to keep was now being devoured by fire. Firefighters were battling the inferno, but Sarah knew it was too late. And then she saw her. Karen stood in her driveway, sipping coffee, watching the flames with an expression Sarah would never forget: satisfaction. The pieces fell into place. The electrical complaints, the HOA's sudden interest in her wiring, the carefully documented weak spots. This wasn't an accident. Karen had just made the worst mistake of her life. Sarah stood frozen, the crackling of flames and the roar of water from the fire hoses fading into the background. The house that had sheltered 3 generations of her family was being consumed before her eyes. But what set her blood boiling wasn't just the fire. It was Karen, standing there with her designer coffee cup, smirking like she had finally won. Fire Chief Martinez approached, his expression grim. "Ma'am, it looks like an electrical fire. These old houses—" "No," Sarah cut in, voice sharp. "I had an inspection last month. Everything was up to code." Martinez hesitated. "Your security system? Maybe it caught something?" Sarah's heart pounded. She pulled out her phone, hands trembling as she accessed her camera feed. But when she clicked play, the footage stopped abruptly at 3 a.m., 4 hours before the fire started. Her cameras had been disabled. This was no coincidence. Through the crowd of onlookers, Sarah spotted two familiar faces, Bob Johnson and Mike Peters, both HOA board members. They stood near the edge of the scene, whispering, shifting uncomfortably. And then she saw it, the mud-caked work boots. The same ones caught on her cameras the night her roses were destroyed. Only now, they were covered in ash. Her stomach twisted. She had spent her career putting criminals behind bars, but she never thought she'd be the target of a conspiracy herself. Then Karen strutted over, her expression a perfect mask of fake sympathy. "Oh, this is just awful," she cooed. "If only you had joined the HOA. We have strict safety guidelines, you know. This sort of thing wouldn't happen if you had just followed the rules." Sarah clenched her fists so hard her nails dug into her palms. Not yet. She forced herself to stay calm, to bite her tongue. She couldn't tip her hand too soon. Instead, she turned and walked away, phone in hand. She made 3 calls. One to the FBI, one to the state attorney's office, and one to a private investigator she trusted. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught Karen watching, a flicker of unease crossing her face. She didn't know who Sarah was calling, but she sensed something was wrong. Good. Let her worry. As the sun rose, Sarah stood in the ashes of her home, her grief hardening into something stronger. Karen thought she had won. She thought she had broken Sarah. She had no idea she had just unleashed something far worse. Sarah wasn't just going to take down Karen. She was going to dismantle the entire corrupt empire Karen had built, piece by piece, brick by brick. And when she was done, Karen wouldn't just lose her power. She would lose everything. Sarah had always believed in the law. She had spent years ensuring justice prevailed in her courtroom. But now, justice wasn't just a principle. It was personal. While Karen paraded around the neighborhood spreading rumors that Sarah had burned her own home for insurance money, Sarah was quietly pulling threads that would unravel the entire HOA. Her first breakthrough came from an old law school friend, now a real estate investigator. Over coffee, he slid a file across the table. "I think you'll want to see this," he said. Sarah flipped through the pages, her breath hitched. Every house in their county that had mysteriously burned down over the past 5 years had been sold to the same shell company. The owner? Karen's sister-in-law. It was a pattern too perfect to be coincidence. Sarah dug deeper. She hired a private investigator who tracked down former homeowners, people who had been harassed, threatened, and ultimately forced to sell. Their stories mirrored hers. Refuse to join the HOA, face endless fines and complaints, then suffer a mysterious accident until they had no choice but to sell at a fraction of their home's worth. The pieces were coming together, but Sarah needed more. Her break came from an unexpected source, Karen's former assistant treasurer. Through her lawyer, she arranged a meeting at a quiet diner 2 towns over. The woman sat across from Sarah, hands trembling as she slid a USB drive across the table. "This has 5 years' worth of HOA financial records," she whispered. "Karen forced me to cook the books. She said if I didn't, She'd report my immigration status. Sarah's pulse pounded as she scanned the documents. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in mysterious cash deposits, right after each fire. Karen wasn't just running a corrupt HOA. She was orchestrating an entire real estate fraud scheme, turning family homes into lucrative development deals. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She combed through old county records, tracing Karen's past. What she found was staggering. Karen had done this before. 3 other historic neighborhoods had suffered the same fate. She moved in, formed an HOA, drove out resistant homeowners, then sold the consolidated land to developers for millions. She even had the audacity to win community service awards for revitalizing the neighborhood. But the most damning discovery came when Sarah uncovered a city planning document. A new highway expansion was in the works, one that required her property as a key development site. Karen's real estate partners had inside information. They had already bought the surrounding properties, but Sarah's home was the last piece. Without it, their multi-million-dollar project would collapse. Sarah sat back in her chair, gripping the folder of evidence. Karen thought she had played the perfect game, but she had underestimated who she was up against. Sarah had spent her career prosecuting criminals who thought they were untouchable. She had seen arrogance, deception, and greed firsthand, but she had never seen it invade her personal life, until now. For months, she had endured Karen's harassment, the endless citations, the fabricated violations, the petty vandalism. She had played along, watching, documenting, waiting, but now she had everything she needed, and it was time to strike. Sarah met with the FBI, laying out every piece of evidence: the fraudulent HOA violations, the shell company buying burned properties, the financial records showing Karen's illicit cash flow. The wire recordings from the former treasurer were the final nail in the coffin. "We've been eyeing this HOA for a while," the lead agent admitted. "But we never had enough to move. This ? This is airtight." Sarah knew she had to be careful. Karen was powerful in their small town. If she suspected what was coming, she'd try to cover her tracks. Sarah needed her to feel safe, right until the moment everything collapsed around her. So she let Karen believe she had won. Karen continued to gloat, making smug comments about troublemakers who don't belong, and publicly discussing her plans for redeveloping the burned lot. Sarah simply smiled. The final piece came when Sarah convinced the FBI to wire up the former treasurer. In a meeting at Karen's house, the woman recorded everything. Karen joking about which house might have an electrical issue next, discussing her developer connections, and even threatening to make the treasurer disappear if she ever spoke out. It was all the FBI needed. The night before the HOA's monthly meeting, Sarah reviewed the case one last time. She wasn't just taking down Karen, she was dismantling an entire network of fraud, corruption, and abuse. The next evening, Sarah arrived at the meeting, dressed in simple slacks and a blazer, blending in with the crowd. Karen, standing at the podium, barely glanced at her. She was too busy enjoying the sound of her own voice. "The property at 247 Maple Street has been declared a public nuisance," Karen announced, her tone triumphant. "We'll be moving forward with redevelopment plans immediately." Murmurs of unease spread through the room. Sarah stood. "I object." Karen's eyes finally landed on her. A slow, smug smile spread across her face. "Oh? Come to accept reality, have you?" Sarah pulled a thick folder from her bag and set it on the table. "Actually, I'm here to present some evidence of my own." She flipped open the folder, revealing the financial records, the emails, and the security footage. Gasps filled the room as Karen's face drained of color. Then Sarah reached into her briefcase one last time, this time pulling out her judicial robes. Karen's smirk vanished. "Federal Judge Sarah Martinez," she announced, "and this HOA is officially under investigation." Karen's coffee cup slipped from her hand, shattering against the floor. The entire room fell into stunned silence. Sarah let the moment hang in the air before continuing. "Karen Thompson, along with several members of this HOA board, is under federal investigation for conspiracy, fraud, and arson." She turned her gaze to Karen's husband. "And let's not forget obstruction of justice and insurance fraud." Right on cue, the doors burst open. FBI agents swarmed the room, badges flashing. Karen stumbled backward, shaking her head. "This is a mistake. You can't do this." "Oh, but we can," one of the agents said, snapping a pair of handcuffs around her wrists. "And we are." Karen's husband, the retired police sergeant who had covered up years of illegal activity, made a break for the door. He barely made it 3 steps before being tackled to the ground. The room erupted into chaos. Gasps, whispers, a few cheers. Sarah stayed where she was, watching Karen's world crumble. She stepped closer as Karen was pulled to her feet, her face pale and panic-stricken. "You know what the biggest mistake criminals make?" Sarah asked, her voice calm but firm. Karen glared at her, eyes flashing with rage. "They get so caught up in their own power," Sarah continued, "that they forget to check who they're really dealing with." The click of the handcuffs echoed through the room as Karen and her accomplices were led away. Sarah turned to face the stunned residents, many of whom had been too scared to stand up to the HOA before now. Mrs. Johnson, the elderly widow who had been bullied into selling her home, wiped away tears. "We should have stood up to them sooner." Sarah placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes," she said softly, "justice takes the long road to make sure it arrives at the right destination." 6 months later, Sarah stood in front of her newly rebuilt Victorian home, the purple trim exactly as her grandmother had painted it. The roses had begun to bloom again, regrown from clippings of the one surviving bush. Karen's old house had been sold to pay restitution to her victims. A kind family had moved in, immigrants who had worked hard to make a new life. Now their children played in the yard where Karen had once stood, taking photos of violations. The neighborhood had changed, but for the better. The HOA was dissolved, replaced by a real community association, one that actually helped its residents instead of terrorizing them. Sarah took a sip of coffee, glancing at the old ceramic mug sitting on her desk. Karen's mug, the one she had dropped when she realized who Sarah really was. It sat there as a reminder. Justice might move slowly, but it never stops. And sometimes, the best revenge isn't just winning. It's rebuilding something more beautiful than what was destroyed. Sarah's battle against the corrupt HOA wasn't just about saving her home. It was about standing up to bullies who abused their power. Karen and her allies thrived on intimidation, believing that fear would keep people silent. But justice, no matter how long it takes, always finds its way to the surface. The biggest mistake Karen made was underestimating Sarah, assuming she was just another homeowner who would cave under pressure. But Sarah's resilience proved that knowledge, patience, and the truth are the most powerful weapons against corruption. Too often, people let injustice slide because it feels easier to comply than to fight. But every time someone chooses to stand their ground, they inspire others to do the same. Sarah's victory wasn't just personal, it changed an entire community for the better. Sometimes life will push you to the breaking point. People will try to take advantage of you, silence you, or make you feel powerless. But real power isn't about control. It's about knowing your worth, standing firm in your beliefs, and fighting for what's right, no matter the odds. Because when you fight for justice, you don't just win, you make the world a better place. Corrupt HOAs, fraudulent real estate schemes, and neighborhood bullies aren't just fiction. They happen every day. Across the country, homeowners face unlawful fines, forced evictions, and intimidation tactics from bad faith organizations that manipulate legal loopholes for profit. If you ever find yourself in a similar situation, remember Sarah's approach. Know your rights. Research your property deed, HOA bylaws, and local laws. Knowledge is your first line of defense. Document everything. Keep records of letters, fines, and interactions. Security cameras can be invaluable evidence. Stay calm, but firm. Bullies thrive on intimidation. Don't react emotionally. Respond with facts. Seek legal help. If you suspect corruption, reach out to a lawyer, real estate investigator, or even law enforcement. And most importantly, never let anyone scare you into giving up what's rightfully yours, because justice, no matter how long it takes, always wins.